Good day, everyone. I am Dave Copper, together with my co-reporters, Mr. Joshua Kabungkag and Miss Argeline Kabungkag. Today, we're going to know the historical views of art. And our topic is all about modernism in the 19th century, the new media, new art forms. But before we proceed into our discussion, let's meet first our objectives. Discuss the historical development of art from modernism in the 19th century to new media, new art forms. Modernism in the 19th century. Modernism was a break with the past and a concurrent search for new forms of expression. Modernism was a cultural movement which spread across Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. It is difficult to define, but generally it was viewed as a move towards change. Traditional methods of life and traditional artistic forms were most impacted by the time's completely industrialized society. People started considering fresh options for more inventive activities and inventions. In this era, artists around the world used new imaginary materials and techniques to create artworks that they felt better reflected the realities and hopes of modern societies. Impressionism. The movement away from art as imitation or representation probably started in France with the work of the Impressionists in the 19th centuries. Impressionism was a radical art movement that began in the late 1800s, centered primarily around Parisian painters. This is a literacy or artistic style that seeks to capture a feeling or experience rather than to achieve accurate depiction. It focuses on how light could define a moment in time, with colors providing definition instead of black lines. To give you my idea on the picture that is provided, when viewing an Impressionism painting, you will see clear, thin brushstrokes that emphasize an exact portrayal of natural light and give the bare impression of form and color. As we noticed, most of the Impressionism art were usually landscapes and it portrays everyday life. To give you more example of Impressionism, there is Olympia in 1863 by Manet, L'Ancien of the Boating Party in 1880 by Renoir, and The Dance Class in 1870 to 1874 by Degas. Post-Impressionism. Post-Impressionism as a term was first used by British and art critic Roger Fry in 1910. Post-Impressionism denotes the phase of modern art wherein artists sought to progress beyond the narrow and narrative style of Impressionism. Post-Impressionism was a predominantly French art movement that developed roughly between 1880 and 1905. Post-Impressionism emerged as a reaction against Impressionist concerns for the naturalistic depiction of light and color. It favored an emphasis on more symbolic content, formal order, and structure. It stressed the artificiality of the picture, and it focused on abstract form and pattern in the application of paint to the surface of the canvas. To give you my idea on the image that is provided, as what you've noticed, it is more focused on using vivid colors, thick application of paint, distinctive brush strokes, and it also portrays real-life subject matter. Post-Impressionists were more likely to utilize artificial or arbitrary colors in their compositions, emphasize geometric patterns, and deform forms for expressive effect. And some examples of Post-Impressionism are The Seed of the Arroyo by Paul Gauguin in 1892, Still Life with Apples by Paul Cézanne in 1895, and Interior Mother Ancestors of the Artist by Edward Villard in 1893. Pointillism or Neo-Impressionism refers to the movement in French painting during the late 19th century, inspired by optical theory, painted using tiny adjacent dabs of primary colors to create the effect of light. Applied scientific optical principles of light and color to create a strictly formalized composition. Neo-Impressionism is characterized by the use of divisionist technique. Divisionism attempted to put Impressionist painting of light and color on a scientific basis by using an optical mixtures of colors. Instead of mixing colors on the palette, which reduces intensity, the primary color components of each color were placed separately on the canvas in tiny dabs so they would mix in the spectator's eyes. Neo-Impressionists aimed to produce correspondence between emotional states and the forms, lines, and colors presented on the canvas that spoke to the modernity of urban life in the age of industrialization. So the image that you can see is a work of Georges Seurat, named A Sunday Afternoon on the Islands of La Grande Jatte. Georges Seurat took 2 years to complete this large-scale painting. This most well-known and significant neo-impressionist painting shows a portion of Parisian society relaxing in a park on a Seine River island, just outside of the city limits on a Sunday afternoon. On Sundays, middle-class Parisians would leave the city to spend time in nature. The relationship between these individuals contributes to the work's sense of modernity by fostering a sense of isolation and separation from one another as well as nervous tension. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Now let's move on to new media, new art forms. What is new media, new art forms? The artists in this period use new materials, new techniques of painting, and develop new theories about how art should reflect and perceive world. They abandoned strict adherence to traditional hierarchies of mediums and embraced any means, including technological, which best serve their purpose. Now, let's move on to Fauvism and Expressionism in 1890 and 1939. What is Fauvism? Fauvism was the first 20th century movement in modern art. It is led by Martin Rothschild. The group was also known as Les Fauves or the Wild Beasts. They used wild colors and used depictions of primitive objects and people. This movement became known as Expressionism and spread notably at Germany. Comparing the two art movements of Fauvism and German Expressionism is like looking at the two sides of a coin. Both rest in the value of color applied in painting, but the Fauvist movement used color to express joy, while the German Expressionism used color to interpret the dark side of emotions, ending up in a much different result. Now we have here example of Fauvism, and it is the Madame Matisse in 1881 by Henri Matisse, and The Scream by Edvard Munch in 1893. Now let's move on to Cubism in 1907 and 1941. What is Cubism? Cubism was the first abstract art that is developed by Pablo Picasso and George Braque. Cubism was also known as the most influential art movement in the 20th century. In Cubist artwork, the objects was broken down into a series of geometric shapes and reassembled in a abstract form. Instead of depicting the objects in a one viewpoint, the Cubist artist depicted it in different viewpoints, selecting from the sight, the memory, and the movement. Cubism had two distinct stages, the analytic cubism and the synthetic cubism. In analytic cubism, the artist reduced the the natural forms to their basic geometric and reconstructed it within their geometric framework in a two-directional picture plane, while the synthetic cubism explore the use of foreign objects and abstract signs. The use of collage on a painting is one example of synthetic cubism. We have here the example of cubism. The Ladies of Avignon by Pablo Picasso in 1907. Now let's move on to Dada in 1916 and 1923. Dada was a artistic and literary movement that began in Zurich, Switzerland in the early 20th century. It emerged out in a negative reaction to the horrors of World War I and rationalism, which many thought had brought war about. Dada was sort of a revolution against the very concept of art that rejected reason and logic, irrationality and intuition. Marcel Duchamp, one of the leading Dada artists, used ready-mades or mass-produced objects. One of his well-known works was the fountain, a urinal which turned upside down, to which he submitted to an exhibition in 1970. Now we have here the image of the fountain which Marcel Duchamp in 1917.
Okay, so the next is Surrealism, 1922 to 1939 AD. Surrealism is a movement in art and literature that began which developed out of Dadaism in the mid-1920s. The movement spread around the globe, eventually affecting other art forms in many countries and languages, as well as philosophy and social theory. The works feature the element of surprise, evocative juxtaposition of strange images in order to include unconscious dream elements. In painting, it is expressed in two techniques: the naturalistic technique in the works of Salvador Dali and the abstract technique in the works of Juan Miro. So surrealist is kind of similar to expressionism. In what way? They both have a message behind your painting. They are both expressing something and they both get their ideas from their imagination. But in the way that they are painted, of course, they are different, and that is what we are going to discuss in this video. So surrealism works on the mysteries of dreams and the unconscious, so it's like liberation of imagination from what most people believe in normal and reasonable. And to make it easier to understand, to make it easier to define, let's start with its root word, surreal. When you look for the definition of the word surreal, you will see that it's a mixture of fact and fantasies. So framing, surrealism is a word. Surreal is a mixture of realism and expressionism. The words surreal and dreamlike are the words that we can associate with surrealism, because basically the paintings is surrealism art that is based on dreamlike ideas. So as you can see the picture on my right side, it is out of ordinary, far from reality, imaginary, eerie, illusion, or strange. Then you are right. So this is an example of surrealistic art. Okay, so the next is abstract expressionism in 1940 to 1960. Abstract expressionism was an American post-World War II art movement that emerged in the 1940s and flourished in the Fiddles. Abstract Expressionism is regarded by many as the golden age of American art and the first American movement to achieve international influence. Although artists in the movement vary greatly in style, they all share the same outlook in the freedom of individual expression. So, abstract expressionism is often considered for its advancement in painting. The ideas had deep resonance in many mediums, including drawing and sculpture. Although it is a accepted designation, abstract expressionism is not an accurate description of the body of work created by this artist. Indeed, the movement comprised many different painting styles, varying in both technique and quality of expression. Despite the variety, abstract expressionism paintings share several broad characteristics. They often use degrees of abstraction, that is, they depict forms unrealistically or at the extreme end, forms not drawn from the visible world. They also emphasize free, spontaneous, and personal, emotional. So the next is pop art in 1950 to 1960. Pop art is an art movement that emerged in the mid 1950s in United Kingdom and became prevalent in the late 1950s in the United States. It depicts methods, styles, and themes of popular culture and employs techniques of commercial art or popular illustration such as comic strips and advertising. So pop art is the movement presents a challenge to traditions of fine art by including imagery from popular and mass culture, such as advertising, comic books, televisions, magazines, food, and mundane mass produced cultural objects that were becoming popular at that time, which led to the emergence of the term popular art. There are different characteristics of pop paintings and sculpture. Number one is pop artists use common image from everyday culture as their resources, including advertisement and consumer goods, celebrities and photographs, and comic strips. Number two is pop artists reflected 60s culture by using new and current materials in their artworks, including acrylic paints and last this time I want you to know the who's who of pop art or the leading artists of this movement. Andy Warhol, popularly known as Andy Warhol, was the central figure of pop art movement, and at my side is an example of his pop art painting. And the next is optical art in 1960, also known as an op art, a style of visual art popularized in 1960s. The term is used to describe artworks which seem to swell and vibrate through their use of optical illusion. This method of painting concerns with the interaction between illusion and picture plane that produces dramatic visual effects that are difficult for the eye to resolve. Most of the known optical art were created only in black and white. Op art is a dynamic visual art stemming from a discordant figure-ground relationship that causes the two planes to be in contradictory and creations of effects through the use of patterns and lines. So, an optical illusion or an optical art that represents our sense of vision and perception to define a reality in different ways. Optical art, also known as an op art, based on the fact that the observer actively participates in pictorial appreciation through visual effects of relief, depth, movements, through lines, flat, and static color. There are types of optical art, and these are abstract art, geometric abstract art, kinetic art, and luminous kinetic art. And on my side is the example of optical art Sanctuary 1947 by Joseph R. Arbers. So the next is photorealism in 1960 to 1970. A figurative movement that is primarily applied to paintings from the United States art movement that began in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The subject matter, usually everyday scenes, is portrayed in an extremely detailed, exacting styles. It is also called superrealism, especially when referring to sculpture. It is the genre of painting using cameras and photographs to gather visual information and to create a painting that appears to be photography. So what is photorealism as an art style? So the name might sound self-explanatory, but the truth is a bit more complicated. And there are a number of details and historical insight that presents photorealism in a new light. The term can also mean slightly different things depending on the context. So, photorealism movement began as a way to accurately render real life more precisely than previously attempted. Gone is the abstract expressionism of movements past, but that doesn't mean there is no message. So, photorealism is a style of art that attempts to achieve the same level of detail and realism as a photograph. Photorealistic paintings and drawings are often mistaken for photographs upon first glance. The labels hyperrealism, neorealism, verism, sharp focus realism, and superrealism are all used to describe photorealistic art. As a movement, photorealism began in the late 60s and reached its height in the 70s within the United States. The term was first coined the artists who projected actual photographs on canvases in order to accurately match all of the little details. Photorealist works of art often center around banal or mundane places or objects. Airbrushing was often used by the first photorealism artists, though other methods are also used.